Good evening. Tonight, the stark reality behind the smoke over southern Lebanon. Despite a fragile ceasefire, the Israeli army continues deep strikes, recently detonating a massive 700-ton blast near the historic Beaufort Castle, claiming to target tunnels. But looking closely, is this merely a security, or is it a calculated destruction of heritage and a psychological war directly endangering healthcare workers and civilians? The United Nations warns these actions severely threaten ongoing negotiations. While political maneuvers and election calculations stall recovery, this remains a question. Is expanding military control under the guise of safety, is it only deepening the reconstruction vacuum and pushing lasting peace further away? Meanwhile, the Russia-Ukraine war has reached another critical juncture. As Moscow intensifies its missile campaign against Ukraine, questions are mounting over Kyiv's air defenses and the future of US support. As Washington reshaping its approach, is the conflict moving towards diplomacy or heading towards another escalation? Let's separate the rhetoric from reality and put these issues in focus. The United Nations warns that ongoing Israeli demolitions in southern Lebanon severely threaten civilian life and cultural heritage, despite the existing ceasefire. Recent massive blasts near the historic Beaufort Castle have sparked international alarm. Israel states it used several hundred tons of explosives to clear what they say is underground tunnels. However, these heavy operations directly endanger a UNESCO-protected site and destroy vital community infrastructure across the south. Lebanese leadership calls the explosions a dangerous escalation that jeopardizes the US-backed security agreement. With crucial negotiations approaching in Rome, diplomats stress that military destruction must stop to give peace a chance. Israeli troops report killing multiple Hezbollah fighters inside southern Lebanon's occupied security zone. An Israeli soldier was also wounded during the overnight clash, highlighting continued unrest despite the ceasefire. The military stated it acted to eliminate immediate threats to its forces and civilians. Meanwhile, Hezbollah remains silent on the incident and has not claimed any new operations for weeks. This violence complicates the recent US-backed peace agreement, or framework. While the deal requires disarming militias and a phased troop withdrawal, ongoing strikes and delays challenge the Lebanese army's deployment across the border. Now joining us from Cairo is Farah Abu Raya, who is a political researcher at Al Habtour Research Center. Thank you very much for being here with us on In Focus on Q News. So we have the Israeli army's use of this 700-ton explosive near Beaufort Castle. Do you think it's targeting tunnels? It's the famous excuse that the Israelis seem to use a lot. There were tunnels there that Hezbollah or Hamas or whoever have been using. Do you think it was targeting tunnels, or do you think they're actually targeting cultural heritage sites?
Well, thank you for having me. Let's start from the strategic and legal perspective. Any military operation must comply with the principles and the protection of civilians' cultural sites under the international humanitarian law. What Israel says or doing with these operations it says it's targeting military infrastructure, but using heavy artillery and firewall power near a UNESCO-listed site like the Beaufort Castle raises serious concerns. The destruction of such a historical site, whether as framed as deliberate or a collateral damage, causes lasting consequences and highlights the importance of protecting historical sites during armed conflict. So Israel actions risks the overall principles of the international humanitarian law.
We think we have a little problem there on your connection. Do we have you back there, Farah Abu Raya? Okay. I'll move on to the next question and see if we have a better connection now. With the ongoing Israeli army drone strikes injuring civilians, even despite the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire. And in this is this security zone merely permanent occupation in disguise?
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Did you hear the question?
Let's continue with the question you just asked. What Israeli army doing now? This touches like a critical concern for the region and the broader Arab diplomatic community. Historically, the unilaterally imposed security zone in southern Lebanon have failed to produce sustainable peace. They've just only intensified the conflict. So when military strikes continue despite the ceasefire, causing civilian casualties, it raises question about the effectiveness of such current security agreement. It signals that Israel aims to manage the conflict through overwhelming force rather than resolving it. So we could say that any true security framework can be built on continuous violation of the Lebanese territorial integrity, which this increasingly resemble like a prolonged de facto occupation rather than a temporary security measures, as Israeli army says.
So do you think that this so-called security zone is merely a permanent occupation in disguise?
It resembles such one, regardless of the Israeli army says, because it causes severe damage on the Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Okay. Now, the Israeli army claims to have eliminated Hezbollah fighters and has suffered, one casualty, it says. Is this exposing the fundamental failure of the current US-backed framework, the framework that was signed in Washington, to enforce a halt to hostilities?
While Israeli actions and what's going on in southern Lebanon exposes the fragility of any security arrangement that relies on a tactical pause rather than a comprehensive security and political settlement. And what we've seen now in southern Lebanon and the mediation of the US or backed security agreement, it reflects such point. So for military solutions alone cannot solve the deeply geopolitical conflict within Lebanon. It requires, or any mediated agreement, even a US-backed one, needs effective impartial monitoring and strong support for the Lebanese army and Lebanese state and institutions.
Now, we've got these meetings coming up in Rome, and Lebanon is seeking to expand the pilot zones. I mean, that's a joke, isn't it? I mean, they haven't even got one pilot zone working yet.
Okay, so regarding the Rome upcoming meeting, Israeli army actions complicate the situation a little bit because we cannot build a diplomatic framework in Rome while systematically dismantling the physical and social infrastructure of southern Lebanon. So if like in Rome, the negotiations based on trust is indeed undermined during the process. Any international negotiations have to have an effective outcome. It must focus first on a coordinated de-escalation of the situation. And many parties or many countries in the region warned about continuous military action and it's over the spillover or the harms it could cause for any future negotiations and peace framework or a final peace framework.
Well, what do you think's going on here then? We've had these meetings, and we had obviously President Aoun in Washington recently. We had Netanyahu in Washington last week. We had the peace framework signed where there were supposed to be these pilot zones, and Netanyahu's supposed to withdraw his troops from these zones. He's yet to do that. So what is the point of this framework? Are we just seeing something to help Netanyahu in his upcoming elections?
Well, it's well known that domestic elections often influence foreign policy decisions, and Netanyahu needs a political win for his elections or his upcoming Knesset elections. But the real question is whether the peace framework can deliver lasting stability. The current one is designed mainly to serve a short-term political interests, so it's unlikely to succeed. But for a long-term peace framework, it must prioritize the full restoration of the Lebanese sovereignty, territorial integrity, and apply the UN resolutions.
Well, we've got a situation now where the Israeli army is continuing to dictate the security narrative through force, pushing on forward even further into Lebanon, not doing what it's supposed to do as part of the framework. We've got President Aoun criticizing Hezbollah, but not really saying much about Israel. Does Lebanon have any leverage when it comes to the upcoming talks in Rome?
Yes, Lebanon's main source of leverage is its international legitimacy and the support of the Arab countries. The Lebanese also, another point is that the Lebanese armed forces remain a key institutional point or a key point that can strengthen the state authority, and applying a peace framework or during the Rome negotiations, the Lebanese armed forces is expected to play a big role. Beirut position, without any strong political, financial, and security support, will cause the instability to continue and affect the wider region.
Now, recent reports highlight the direct targeting of healthcare workers. And we've seen this before as a tactic, haven't we? Where a missile goes in, the healthcare workers turn up, and then another missile goes in to kill the healthcare workers. How can there not be any international accountability for these kind of attacks by Israel?
Well, what we are witnessing now is a severe crisis or weakness in the global multilateral system. Like the mechanisms of accountability for the UN Security Council or international laws are increasingly weakened or paralyzed, let's say, by the politicization and the double standards within the international community and within the parties in the crisis itself. So, and many countries in the region repeatedly warned and stated that the impartial application or failing to hold actors accountable for the violations set a dangerous model for negotiation and for reaching a final peace agreement.
And how does the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure by the Israeli army deepen the reconstruction problems that are going to be happening and the trap that southern communities are in?
While Israel targeting roads, water, infrastructure, network, agricultural lands, this goes beyond its military objectives. It constitutes a strategy for destabilization and weakening the southern Lebanon, making the reconstruction of the community hard, making the return of the displaced people even harder, causing like a dynamic where the southern Lebanon communities are in cycle of dependency and vulnerability. So this is the more like, let's say, the immediate effect of civilian targeting by the Israeli armed forces.
And the UN called these demolitions deeply concerning. That doesn't actually carry any weight, though, does it?
Well, the UN, we have to differentiate between the UN moral and legal authority and what it can enforce or its enforcement capability. The UN warnings is like part of holding the international law, documenting violations, establishing like baseline for future accountability. However, without the UN Security Council unilateral action to impose consequences on the violations, these warnings sadly remain like lacking of operational weight or effectiveness to apply for the Israeli or any violators in such so.
And Hezbollah has been remaining silent on the recent situation in southern Lebanon. Is there a vacuum now?
Well, like this moment present a critical and a window and a risky window of opportunity for the Lebanese armed forces. In the long term, security should depend on the national armed forces of the country. So the security, like while any security vacuum could increase tension in short term, it also highlights the need for a stronger international, as we said before, international political, financial, and security support for the Lebanese armed forces. So it's the top priority strengthening the role of the armed forces in southern Lebanon to regain the stability and the security back for this part of the country.
And how can we expect a sustainable peace framework, do you think, when the Israeli army's actions are proving that military expansion is what Israel is consistently prioritizing over any diplomatic commitments that have been made?
Well, this is like one of the main challenges facing the region. The lasting peace cannot be achieved, even the Rome negotiations to lead to a lasting peace cannot be achieved if diplomatic efforts continue to be hindered by military operation and military escalation on the ground.
Well, thank you very much for that, Farah Abu Raya, political researcher at El Habtoor Research Center. Thank you for being with us. And now let's move on to Russia-Ukraine. Russian ballistic missiles struck Kyiv early today, killing at least 9 people and injuring more than 30. That's according to Ukrainian officials. And according to the New York Times, the attack came hours after President Trump reversed course on a plan to allow Ukraine to produce US-designed Patriot missiles, a key defense system against ballistic threats. It was the second deadly Russian air assault on Kyiv in 2 days, as Moscow intensifies strikes while Ukraine warns of dwindling air defense supplies. Trump said he halted the Patriot production plan, citing concerns over sharing sensitive technology. The decision has raised concerns in Kyiv over its ability to strengthen its defenses against Russian missile attacks. Joining us from New York now is P.L. Da Silva, who's a political science professor. Good evening, Professor. Nice to have you back on Q News. So we have Russia's latest missile barrage on Kyiv coming as Ukraine is very worried about its air defense capabilities. How do you assess the situation as it stands today?
So if you listen to Professor Theodore Postel from MIT, he's been telling the Pentagon for 20 years that their Patriot PAC-3 missiles, the PAC-2 and the PAC-3, as well as the THAAD, so basically his position is that the U.S. Department of Defense and the defense contractors have been selling these very expensive missile systems, $5 million per missile, like used car salesmen. So they don't actually work. He said you can't hit a bullet with a bullet. And the Gulf countries have bought tons of these, as well as the Ukrainians, and they don't work. And simply the incoming missiles, especially the hypersonic, intermediate, and ISR controlled drones, they have a field day, and that is the situation. So it's a tit for tat, but Russia is a much bigger country. They have 143.4 million people, even after like a 4 million have left the country because they don't want to be conscripted. Whereas Ukraine has had a significant amount of people leave. Before the war, they were like 42 million. Now they're down to 28 million. And that tells the sad and sorry story of what's happening to the Ukraine war. The people are voting with their feet and they're leaving Ukraine in droves, mass exodus. And that's the situation. So, despite everything that you hear in the mainstream legacy media, oh, Ukraine is winning, blah, 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 none of that is true.
Okay, well, so coming to the Patriot system then, which you said doesn't work and is being sold like like a used car salesman. So President Trump's decision to say, "Oh, we can't be sharing this technology with you," it doesn't really mean much, then, does it?
Yeah, no, it doesn't mean anything really, truly, for the people who know. And Ted Postal has been telling the Pentagon for 20 years, you got to change your systems because they don't work.
But what do you think of the relationship then between President Trump and Zelensky? A lot was made of it this week, and how they seem a lot more chummy, and that he seemed much more well disposed towards Ukraine. What's your take on that?
Affairs of state don't depend on the characteristics of the leaders and their whims and their fancies. So affairs of state are much more serious. It involves a lot of gravitas, and the if you read the tea leaves, you can see that Ukraine is going to be abandoned, and it'll have to be the Europeans who try to push this through, and they're not doing a very good job about it.
Okay, and Washington is supposedly trying to push Moscow through sanctions, whilst limiting and shaping the support for Ukraine. How do you think President Trump is feeling about President Putin at the moment?
I think President Trump and President Putin have always had a good relationship, and President Trump has always been careful not to make ad hominem attacks on President Putin, though he does this to all and sundry across the board, but certainly not President Putin. So that says something, that there is a respect, a degree of respect, and that kind of filters down to the actions that the U.S. takes vis-a-vis the Russians.
Okay, so there is some kind of reasonably good relationship there. When it comes to Ukraine, and it says that it's running short of air defense interceptors, is this a serious shortage, or as you say, do these air defense interceptors aren't really worth a damn, to be honest?
Yeah, that's actually true, because they've been firing three Patriots per incoming missile, and they depleted their stockpile. Same situation in Israel as well. So they also don't have interceptor missiles. And the worst part of it is that they don't work. It just gives you a feel-good factor that, oh, we've got these interceptor missiles, and you can see these flashbangs in the sky. But actually, if you look at the ground, there's huge amounts of incoming missile detonations and impact. And that's what's happening. So the Russians have the ability to fire, dozens and dozens of missiles that are coming in. And we should not forget what happened to the Nazis during the Battle of Kursk. They invaded the Soviet Union, and the Russians started building tanks en masse across the Urals. And then finally, when it came to the Battle of Kursk, the Russian tanks simply swamped the Nazi, much better than the panzers, but there were not enough of them. And that's exactly what's happening here in this missile war. The drones that the Ukrainians are using, okay, it's wonderful, fireworks and refineries on fire, the 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 Russian Amazon system, warehouses on fire. But actually, the incoming missiles are much, much more. And I predict that at some point, the Ukrainians will even lose Odessa. And I think that's when the war will end.
Well, you've made that point, I think, and you've said that despite what you might hear in the media, the Ukraine is not starting to win this war. And you mentioned the Russian version of Amazon, the factory that was hit by Ukraine, but Russia does appear to be increasing its attacks inside Ukraine.
On both sides. And nobody wants to go and get killed or maimed. So therefore, the war is unpopular, and unless the Ukrainians are willing to, agree with the Russians and lose the Donetsk and the eastern part of the country, I don't see this ending in a very nice, neat way. It is pretty ugly at the moment on the ground.
So who is Ukraine? Who does Ukraine have to depend on in order to defend itself? Are we talking Europe here, or is it getting more support now from the United States?
No, I mean you have the British there with their storm cloud. It's called the missile that they storm cloud. So you have British teams in there. Six is there. You have the Germans and others who are trying to help the Ukrainians with targeting, but it's targeting without an objective. There is no exit strategy. There is no de-escalation. It's simply poking the bear and make it suffer and bleed. And the bear does the same to the Ukrainians, and it's not Brits or Germans or French or Americans even who are dying. It is the Ukrainians. They bleed for Europe, but this is not going to end with a victory.
Well, you say that Ukraine is bleeding for Europe. So to what end then? If it's not going to end in a victory, well, what is the point?
Exactly. So that's the point. So my argument and thesis is that things were actually quite good when Angela Merkel was at the helm in Germany. Everything was fine. There's a lot of Russian money in England. The stock markets are doing well. Everything was going fine without this messy war. And had it been kept to that at that level, I think, without fighting and provoking the Russians into invading Ukraine by unnecessarily expanding NATO and the European Union towards what end? You don't want to have paranoid Russians think they're being encircled, and then you get a knee-jerk reaction, and that knee-jerk reaction has been going on for years now.
So you see
So
it. So you're talking about. So, sorry, carry on.
no, and so everybody needs to take a step back, look at it, dispassionately, and agree on the negotiating table. There are no military victories to be had. Not in Ukraine, not in the Iran war. There are no military victories. Talk to any general, any top CIA, officer, and they'll tell you no military victories.
So going back to the good old days when so Angela Merkel's Chancellor of Germany, they're buying a lot of gas. The oligarchs have all their money in London, and they're buying up the properties in Kensington and Mayfair and all these very rich areas of London. We have the occasional polonium dart hit at some old KGB asset from years ago, but things were good then, you're saying?
Things were extremely good. I mean, they were buying properties in Chelsea. My dear friend, Lord Daniel Brennan, had an oligarch as his neighbor. I mean, things
and
were
a Saudi
very,
prince on the other side.
on the other side, exactly.
Indeed. So then we go to the point of you're saying that it wasn't a Putin who just decided to go into Ukraine because he thought that Ukraine was a part of Russia, as he said, and Zelensky was a Nazi. It was the expansion of the EU, or potential expansion of the EU and NATO, that done it.
Yeah, so if you know that the Russians are paranoid, why go prod the bear? That's my question. What on earth did it achieve?
Yeah. So, but I mean, there has to be. There's not. Well, some people would say that, but from the European perspective, it would be that this was just a man who's crazy for expansionism and wants to go back to the days before the Soviet Union collapsed, and even further backward to the Russian Empire.
He would like to. I mean, everybody has a pipe dream. Donald Trump would like to have Greenland, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen.
And what do you think Russia's making of the U.S. decision by Trump not to allow the Patriot production in Ukraine?
But everybody knows they don't work, so what?
But does Putin know they don't work?
Of course.
Okay.
They're firing missiles, incoming missiles at will.
Right. Okay. So looking ahead then, where do we see this moment going? Is it going to increase the urgency for diplomacy? Can you see a nice little meeting between Putin and Zelensky with Trump as the mediator at any point in the future?
Each side has to be willing to give up something in order to achieve the results that are needed. I was involved in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and what we did was basically we locked up the IRA and UVF guys and didn't let them out till there was an agreement, and we paid them lots of money under the table, and that's how it happened. So you could do a similar thing on a larger scale.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I would love to dive in and talk more about your involvement there with the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. It might give us some ways of getting through some of the problems that we have right now. From New York, Professor P.L. De Silva, political science professor. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm going out to buy some Patriot missiles now. Now, it brings us to the end of this episode of In Focus. Thanks for watching. Stay with us for an update on the main news in just a few moments, and have a very nice Saturday night.